Welcome back to another episode of True Crime Untold Cases. I'm your host, Harper Quinn. On a warm Alabama night in July 1999, two 17-year-old best friends, J.B. Beasley and Tracie Hawlett, made a routine phone call after getting lost on their way home from a party. It would be their final communication. The next day, both girls were found shot execution style in the trunk of their car. For 20 years, their killer walked free among the residents of Ozark, Alabama, until a breakthrough in DNA technology finally revealed a suspect that no one saw coming. Tonight, we dive into a case that shattered a small town's sense of security and shows just how far forensic science has come in the pursuit of justice. On a warm summer evening in July 1999, the small city of Ozark, Alabama was forever changed when two 17-year-old best friends ventured out to attend a birthday party. J.B. Beasley and Tracie Hawlett were typical teenagers, vibrant, full of dreams, and looking forward to their senior year of high school. Neither could have imagined that this ordinary summer night would be their last. The events began on July 31st, 1999, when J.B. and Tracie left Dothan, Alabama, in J.B.'s black Mazda 929. They were heading to a field party in Headland to celebrate the birthday of one of their friends. The girls were familiar with the area, but somehow got turned around on the rural roads after leaving the celebration. Around 11:30 that night, Tracie called her mother, Carol Roberts, from a payphone in Ozark. The conversation seemed routine enough. Tracie explained that they had gotten lost, but had stopped to get directions. She assured her mother they would be home soon. Carol Roberts would later recall that her daughter sounded completely normal, maybe even a little embarrassed about losing their way. It was the kind of call any parent of a teenager might receive, and there was no indication of trouble. But J.B. and Tracie never made it home that night. When dawn broke on August 1st, both sets of parents were frantic. They had spent the night calling hospitals, police stations, and anyone who might have seen the girls. The search began immediately, with law enforcement and volunteers combing the areas between Dothan and Ozark. The discovery came just hours later, and it was devastating. J.B.'s black Mazda was found parked on Herring Avenue in Ozark, less than 2 miles from where the girls had made their last phone call. The car was locked, and there were no immediate signs of foul play. But when officers opened the trunk, they found both teenagers inside. Each had been shot once in the head with a .38 caliber handgun. The crime scene told a horrifying story. Both girls were fully clothed, but investigators found evidence that J.B. had been sexually assaulted. There were no signs of a struggle inside the car, leading detectives to believe the girls might have been forced into the trunk at gunpoint. The positioning of their bodies suggested they had been placed in the trunk after their deaths. The community was shocked to its core. Ozark, with its population of roughly 15,000 at the time, was the kind of place where people left their doors unlocked and kids played freely in the streets. The brutal murder of two innocent teenagers shattered that sense of security. Within days, the Alabama Bureau of Investigation had joined local law enforcement in what would become one of the most extensive investigations in the state's history. The initial investigation was intense and far-reaching. Detectives interviewed hundreds of people, including partygoers from the birthday celebration, locals who might have been in the area that night, and anyone who had been near the payphone where the girls made their final call. They collected dozens of DNA samples and followed up on countless leads. One of the most puzzling aspects of the case was the location where the car was found. Herring Avenue was a relatively quiet street, but it wasn't completely isolated. Several residents reported being home that night, yet no one heard gunshots. This led investigators to believe the girls might have been killed elsewhere and their bodies transported to that location. The evidence collected at the scene included a single fingerprint on the trunk of the car and DNA evidence from JB's assault. In 1999, DNA technology was already a valuable tool in criminal investigations, but it wasn't as advanced as it would later become. The samples were preserved, but initial database searches yielded no matches. As weeks turned into months, the investigation continued at full force. Billboards went up across southeast Alabama, displaying the girls' photos and offering a reward for information. The case was featured on national television shows, including America's Most Wanted. Tips came in from across the country, but none led to a breakthrough. The families of both girls struggled to cope with their devastating loss. Carol Roberts, Tracie's mother, spoke frequently to the media, determined to keep the case in the public eye. "These were good girls," she would say. "They weren't out looking for trouble. They just got lost and asked the wrong person for directions." JB's parents were equally devastated. Their daughter had been a talented athlete who played softball and basketball. She had been talking about college and had dreams of becoming a nurse. Tracie had been an honor student who worked part-time at a local restaurant. Both girls had their whole lives ahead of them. As the investigation continued, several theories emerged. Some believed the girls had encountered a predator who took advantage of their vulnerable situation when they stopped for directions. Others wondered if they had been specifically targeted. The random nature of the crime, two girls simply getting lost on their way home, made it all the more terrifying. Local law enforcement faced intense pressure to solve the case. The double homicide was the biggest crime in Ozark's recent history, and the community demanded answers. The police chief at the time, Tony Spivey, made public promises that they wouldn't rest until the killer was found. But despite the dedication of investigators and the resources poured into the case, years began to pass without an arrest. The investigation would take numerous turns over the years, with several potential suspects being investigated and cleared. Police looked into similar crimes in the region, wondering if there might be connections to other unsolved cases. They re-interviewed witnesses, re-examined evidence, and continued to collect DNA samples from persons of interest. By the mid-2000s, the case had gone cold, but it was never forgotten. The local police department kept a photo of JB and Tracie on the wall, a constant reminder of their unsolved murder. Every year, on the anniversary of their deaths, local media would run stories about the case, hoping to generate new leads. The families continued their quest for justice, marking painful anniversaries and wondering if they would ever know who killed their daughters. They established scholarships in the girls' names and worked to keep their memories alive in the community. But the question remained, who had encountered JB and Tracie on that summer night in 1999, and why had they chosen to end their young lives so violently? The case would remain unsolved for nearly 2 decades, but advances in DNA technology and genetic genealogy would eventually open new doors in the investigation. What happened next would shock the community of Ozark once again, leading to unexpected developments that no one could have predicted when those 2 teenage girls first went missing on that warm July night. The breakthrough in the case came in March 2019, nearly 20 years after the murders. The Ozark Police Department announced they had arrested Coley McCraney, a 45-year-old local man who had been living in the area at the time of the murders. The arrest stunned the community, particularly because McCraney wasn't someone who had ever been on law enforcement's radar during the original investigation. The path to McCraney's arrest began when investigators decided to try a relatively new investigative technique, genetic genealogy. Following the success of this method in solving the Golden State Killer case in 2018, many cold case units across the country began exploring this option. The DNA evidence collected from J.B. Beasley's sexual assault was submitted to Parabon Nanolabs, a company specializing in DNA phenotyping and genetic genealogy. Using the DNA profile, genetic genealogists were able to construct a family tree that eventually led them to McCraney. When investigators obtained a DNA sample from him, it matched the evidence from the crime scene. The match probability was astronomical, 1 in 110 trillion, according to prosecutors. What made the arrest even more surprising was McCraney's life in the intervening years. He had been living openly in the Dothan area, working as a truck driver and operating a body shop. He was married, active in his church, and had no significant criminal record. Those who knew him described him as a friendly, God-fearing family man who regularly attended services and participated in community events. In fact, McCraney had served in the military and had worked as a corrections officer in the early 1990s. He had been living less than a mile from where the girls' bodies were found in 1999, but nothing about his behavior at the time had drawn suspicion. This ordinary life he had built made the allegations against him all the more shocking to those who knew him. When news of the arrest broke, both victims' families expressed mixed emotions. There was relief that someone had finally been caught, but also anger that the suspect had been living freely in their community for all these years. Carol Roberts, Tracie's mother, told reporters, "All this time he's been right here, living his life, watching us suffer, knowing what he did to our girls." However, the case would take another unexpected turn. McCraney's defense team began to construct a narrative that would challenge the prosecution's version of events. They pointed out that despite the DNA evidence linking McCraney to J.B. Beasley, there was no physical evidence connecting him to Tracie Hawlett. They also questioned why, if McCraney was the killer, his fingerprints weren't found on the car. McCraney's attorney would later make a shocking claim that any sexual contact between McCraney and J.B. Beasley had been consensual, and that McCraney had nothing to do with the murders. This defense strategy sparked outrage among the victims' families and in the community. The prosecution strongly rejected this theory, pointing out that both girls were found shot execution style in the trunk of the car. The case also brought attention to racial dynamics in the investigation. McCraney, who is African American, was never questioned during the original investigation, despite living so close to the crime scene. Some community members and civil rights activists questioned whether implicit bias had affected the initial investigation, which had focused primarily on white suspects. The legal proceedings that followed McCraney's arrest were complicated by several factors. The COVID-19 pandemic caused significant delays in the court system. Additionally, the defense team filed numerous motions challenging the admissibility of certain evidence and requesting changes of venue due to pretrial publicity. The prosecution faced its own challenges. After 20 years, some witnesses had died, others' memories had faded, and some physical evidence had degraded. However, they maintained that the DNA evidence, combined with circumstantial evidence about McCraney's presence in the area that night, created a strong case. As the case moved through the legal system, new details emerged about the night of the murders. Cell phone tower records placed McCraney in the vicinity of the payphone where the girls had stopped to call home. Witnesses came forward with memories of seeing a man matching McCraney's description in the area that night. Though after 20 years, such recollections were understandably questioned by the defense. The investigation also revealed that McCraney had been familiar with the area where the girls were found. His job as a truck driver meant he regularly traveled the roads where J.B. and Tracie had gotten lost. This led prosecutors to theorize that he might have encountered the girls when they were asking for directions. The case brought renewed attention to the vulnerability of young women and the dangers they face. The simple act of getting lost and asking for directions had led to tragedy, a fact that resonated with many people who could imagine themselves or their loved ones in a similar situation. As court proceedings continued, the the community of Ozark remained divided. Some were convinced of McCraney's guilt, while others found it hard to reconcile the charges with the man they had known for years. The case raised difficult questions about how well we really know our neighbors and whether someone capable of such violence could live undetected in a community for so long. The families of JB and Tracie continued to attend every court hearing, determined to see the case through to its conclusion. They had waited 20 years for answers, and now they were forced to relive their trauma as details of that terrible night were examined in court. The case also highlighted the dramatic advances in forensic science over the previous 2 decades. The same DNA that had yielded no matches in 1999 had become the key to solving the case, thanks to the evolution of genetic genealogy. This development gave hope to families of other cold case victims, showing that the passage of time doesn't necessarily mean justice is impossible. The case against Coley McCraney continued to evolve as it made its way through the legal system. One of the most significant developments came when his defense team filed a motion challenging the constitutionality of genetic genealogy evidence. They argued that the technique, which involves searching public DNA databases and constructing family trees, constituted an invasion of privacy not just for the suspect, but for all their biological relatives who had submitted DNA to genealogy websites. The prosecution countered by citing numerous precedents where genetic genealogy had led to successful convictions in other cold cases. They emphasized that the DNA databases used were public and that the technique merely provided investigators with leads that still required traditional police work to verify. The judge ultimately ruled in the prosecution's favor, allowing the genetic genealogy evidence to stand. During pretrial hearings, more details emerged about the night of July 31, 1999. Security camera footage from a nearby convenience store, though grainy and degraded after 2 decades, showed a vehicle similar to McCraney's in the vicinity of the payphone where the girls had stopped. While the quality wasn't sufficient to definitively identify the vehicle or its driver, prosecutors argued it supported their timeline of events. The defense team continued to pursue their controversial strategy of claiming consensual contact between McCraney and J.B. Beasley. This approach faced significant challenges, not least of which was explaining how this scenario could have led to both girls being found dead in the trunk. The prosecution pointed out that both victims were college-bound honors students with no history of risk-taking behavior, and that the defense's theory contradicted everything known about their characters. In 2022, a significant breakthrough came when investigators located a witness who had never before come forward. The witness, who had been a teenager himself in 1999, recalled seeing 2 girls matching JB and Tracie's descriptions talking to a man near the payphone. He had been too scared to come forward at the time, but the arrest of McCraney had prompted him to finally share what he had seen. While he couldn't positively identify McCraney as the man he saw, his description of events aligned with the prosecution's timeline. The case also brought attention to other unsolved crimes in the region from the same time period. Investigators began reviewing cold cases from the late 1990s to determine if there might be any connections to McCraney. While no definitive links were established, the process of reviewing these cases led to new leads in other investigations. As the trial date approached, both the prosecution and defense teams grappled with the challenges of presenting a 20-year-old case to a jury. Many of the original investigators had retired or passed away. Crime scene photos and physical evidence had to be carefully preserved and authenticated. The passage of time had made some aspects of the case more difficult to prove, while advances in technology had made others clearer. The families of J.B. Beasley and Tracie Hawlett continued to attend every court proceeding, their presence a constant reminder of the human cost of this tragedy. Carol Roberts, Tracie's mother, spoke about how the years of waiting had affected her. 20 years is a long time to wait for justice, but it's even longer to wait for answers. We still don't know why. We may never know why. The case became a focal point for discussions about the effectiveness of genetic genealogy in solving cold cases. Law enforcement agencies across the country watched closely, knowing that the outcome could influence how this technique would be used in future investigations. Privacy advocates and legal scholars debated the implications of using family DNA databases to solve crimes, while victims' rights groups pointed to cases like this one as evidence of the technique's value. As the legal proceedings continued, the community of Ozark remained divided. Some residents struggled to reconcile the image of the church-going family man they knew with the charges he faced. Others questioned how someone capable of such violence could have lived among them undetected for so long. The case served as a reminder that appearances can be deceiving, and that the monsters in our midst don't always look like monsters. The impact of the case extended far beyond the courtroom. It sparked discussions about safety in small towns, about the vulnerability of young women, and about the way society handles cold cases. It also demonstrated how advances in forensic science could bring hope to families who had waited decades for answers. For the investigators who had worked the case over the years, the arrests and subsequent legal proceedings brought a mixture of satisfaction and frustration. While they were glad to finally have a suspect in custody, many wished they could have solved the case sooner, sparing the families years of uncertainty and pain. As the case continues to make its way through the legal system, it serves as both a cautionary tale and a testament to the persistence of law enforcement and the evolution of investigative techniques. The murders of J.B. Beasley and Tracie Hawlett changed Ozark forever, but their case also changed the way we think about cold cases and the possibility of finding justice, even after decades have passed. For the families, friends, and community members who remembered two vibrant 17-year-old girls with their whole lives ahead of them, no resolution could ever truly bring closure. But the progress in the case at least offered the possibility of answers to questions that had haunted them for more than 20 years.